I stood frozen in my father's study, staring at the email on my laptop screen. My sister Karen's message was brief and cold. Sold Dad's lakehouse for $2.3 million, closing next Friday. Buyers already wired the deposit. This is what he wanted. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking. That lakehouse wasn't just property. It was where I'd spent the last 8 years of my life, caring for Dad through 2 strokes, countless hospital visits, and the slow, cruel progression of dementia. It was where he'd held my hand during chemo when my husband left me. It was where he'd promised, dozens of times, "This place is yours, Claire. You've sacrificed everything. It's yours." And now my sister, who hadn't visited in 3 years, who hadn't called on his birthday, who didn't even come to his bedside in those final weeks, was selling it out from under me. That was 2 months ago. Today was Dad's memorial service. The September afternoon was perfect, the kind Dad would have loved. Warm sunlight filtered through the windows of the community center we'd rented. About 60 people had come, mostly Dad's friends from the Rotary Club, neighbors from the lake, a few distant cousins. I'd spent the morning arranging photos on poster boards, each one a memory that stabbed at my heart. Dad teaching me to fish, Dad walking me down the aisle, Dad holding my daughter Emma when she was born. Karen arrived late, naturally. She swept in wearing a black designer dress that probably cost more than I'd spent on groceries in 6 months. Her husband Brad followed, checking his phone. They hadn't even bothered to bring their kids, Dad's only other grandchildren besides Emma. "Claire," Karen said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "Lovely setup, very touching." I wanted to scream at her right then. But this was Dad's day. I'd planned to wait, to handle this privately, to be dignified. That was my mistake. The service was beautiful. Dad's best friend Tom spoke about their fishing trips. Mrs. Henderson from next door talked about Dad's garden, how he'd always shared his tomatoes. I stood up and shared the story about Dad teaching me to drive in that old pickup truck, how patient he'd been when I'd stalled it 17 times on a hill. Then Karen stood up. "I'd like to say a few words," she announced, moving to the front of the room. She pulled out a folded paper from her purse. As many of you know, Dad was very particular about his final wishes. He left clear instructions about everything. My stomach dropped. Dad wanted his affairs settled quickly and cleanly, Karen continued, her voice taking on that professional tone she used in her real estate business. That's why, in accordance with his power of attorney and his explicit verbal instructions to me, I've arranged the sale of the lakehouse property for $2.3 million. The proceeds will be split according to the will, but Dad was very clear that he wanted the property sold immediately. He didn't want it to become a burden to anyone. People nodded. A few murmured their agreement. It sounded reasonable when she said it like that. "Dad specifically told me," Karen said, making eye contact with several people in the room, "that he didn't want Claire to feel obligated to maintain such a large property. He knew how hard these last years had been for her, and he wanted her to be free to start fresh." I felt my face burning. Several people were looking at me with sympathy now, like Karen had just done me some huge favor. "The sale closes Friday," Karen finished. "It's what he wanted, what he needed, and I'm grateful I could honor his wishes." She sat down to a smattering of applause. I sat there, paralyzed. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for me to say something, to confirm this touching story of sisterly consideration. Brad was already talking to Cousin Michael about property values in the area. "Mrs. Henderson patted my hand. "It's for the best, dear," she whispered. "You need to move forward with your life." I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I locked the door and leaned against the sink, trying to breathe. My reflection looked pale and old. At 63, I'd spent 8 years of my life caring for Dad. I'd given up my job at the library. I'd moved into the lakehouse full-time. I'd learned to manage medications, navigate insurance, advocate with doctors. I'd held his hand through the terrifying moments when he didn't know who I was. I'd been there every single day. And Karen had been there for maybe 15 total days, in 8 years. Usually just Christmas, if that. But she had the papers. Somehow, she had documents that gave her authority. I washed my face and went back out. The service was wrapping up. People were helping themselves to coffee and the cookies I'd baked that morning. Tom caught my eye and gave me a sad smile. He knew. He'd been there, seen everything. But what could he say? Karen cornered me by the coffee table. Claire, I know this is hard, but it's really for the best. The money will help you get back on your feet. You can get a nice little apartment somewhere, maybe go back to work part-time. Dad promised me that house, I said quietly. He was confused at the end, Karen said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. You know how the dementia was. He probably didn't remember what he'd said from one day to the next. He promised me for 8 years. Long before the dementia got bad. Karen's expression hardened slightly. Well, the legal documents say otherwise. I have power of attorney. I have his written authorization. Unless you want to hire a lawyer and drag this through the courts, which would just eat up money neither of us can spare, I suggest you accept reality. She walked away before I could respond. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. People offered condolences. Someone asked when I'd be moving out of the lakehouse. I heard myself answering in monosyllables, like I was watching someone else have this conversation. By 5 o'clock, everyone had left. I drove back to the lakehouse in my old Honda, taking the winding road along the water. The setting sun turned the lake gold. I'd driven this route thousands of times over the years. Every curve was familiar. The house sat at the end of a private drive, surrounded by pine trees. It wasn't fancy, just a comfortable 3-bedroom with a wraparound porch and a dock. But Dad had built it himself in the 70s, and every board had a story. This was where my mother had lived until she died of cancer when I was 16. This was where I'd brought Emma every summer. This was home. I let myself in and stood in the entryway. Dad's jacket still hung on the hook by the door. His reading glasses sat on the side table. I'd been slowly going through his things, but I couldn't bear to pack up everything yet. I made myself tea and sat on the porch, watching the water. How had this happened? When had Karen gotten power of attorney? Dad had been so adamant that everything was arranged, that I'd be taken care of. Had he really changed his mind? No. I knew my father. Even with dementia, he'd been consistent about this. He'd written me notes, left me voicemails, told me over and over. The house was mine. I went inside and started searching. Dad had kept files in his study, organized in labeled folders. I'd seen the will before. I knew I was mentioned. But I'd never looked at the details because Dad was handling everything, and then after he died, Karen had swooped in with her lawyers and her paperwork, and I'd been too grief-stricken to fight. I found the will in the 3rd drawer. I read it carefully. The house was left to me, explicitly. The lakehouse property at 847 Pinewood Drive to my daughter Claire Margaret Thompson, in recognition of her devoted care and companionship. I sat back, my heart pounding. If the will said the house was mine, how could Karen be selling it? I called Karen. She didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. I called Brad. He picked up on the 4th ring. Claire, this isn't a good time. How is Karen selling the house when the will leaves it to me? There was a pause. The power of attorney supersedes the will in this case. Karen was authorized to make financial decisions on your father's behalf. But he's dead. Power of attorney ends at death. Another pause, longer this time. I'm not a lawyer, Claire. You should talk to Karen about this. He hung up. I sat there, staring at the will. Something was very wrong. The next morning, I went to see Dad's lawyer, Roger Hastings. He'd handled Dad's affairs for 20 years. His office was in town, above the hardware store. Roger was in his 70s, white-haired and kind-faced. He looked surprised to see me. Claire! I'm so sorry about your father. How are you holding up? I need to ask you about the will, I said. And about power of attorney. His expression shifted slightly. Come in, sit down. I sat in the worn leather chair across from his desk and showed him the will. This says the house is mine. Yes, Roger said carefully. That's what your father wanted. Then how is my sister selling it? Roger's face went pale. Selling it? What are you talking about? I explained everything. The email, the memorial service announcement, the closing on Friday. Roger stood up abruptly and went to his filing cabinet. He pulled out a folder and flipped through it, his expression growing increasingly concerned. Claire, I need to ask you something. Did your sister ever come to see your father in the months before he died? Specifically, did she come in March? March. That had been the worst month. Dad had pneumonia on top of everything else. I'd barely slept, spending nights in the chair by his bed. She came for 2 days, I said. Said she wanted to help. She mostly stayed in the guest room and made phone calls. Why? Roger sat down heavily. Because I have a document here dated March 15th, supposedly signed by your father, giving Karen power of attorney for all financial matters. But I didn't prepare this document. And I never witnessed your father signing anything in March. My throat went dry. What are you saying? I'm saying this doesn't look like your father's signature. The tremor's wrong. Your father had Parkinson's. His signature had a specific shake to it. This is too smooth. He pulled out another document, one I recognized. Dad's actual will, which Roger had prepared. The signature was shaky, uncertain. The one on the power of attorney was much steadier. She forged it, I whispered. I can't say that definitively without a handwriting expert. But Claire, if this document is fraudulent, then your sister has no authority to sell that house. And if she's already accepted money from buyers, she's committed fraud. I felt dizzy. What do I do? First, you need to stop the sale. I'll file an emergency injunction today. Second, we need to get this signature analyzed. And third, he looked at me seriously. You need to prepare yourself. If Karen forged this, she's committed a serious crime. This won't just be a family dispute. This will involve the police. I thought about Karen at the memorial service, so confident, so sure of herself. I thought about all those people nodding along, believing her story. Do it, I said. File everything. The injunction was granted by 5 o'clock that afternoon. The sale was halted pending investigation. I got a furious call from Karen 20 minutes later. What the hell are you doing? She screamed. You're going to ruin everything. Did you forge Dad's signature? I asked quietly. Silence. Claire, you don't understand. I needed that money. Brad's business is underwater. We're going to lose our house. I put Dad in your care assuming you'd be reasonable about dividing assets. You forged his signature. He was dying anyway, and you got to live rent-free for 8 years while I was working and raising kids. This was supposed to even things out. I felt cold. You're admitting it. Another silence, and then I heard her catch her breath. You're recording this. I wasn't, actually. But I didn't correct her. I'm going to fight this, Karen said. I have the document. Good luck proving anything. She hung up. But I didn't need to prove anything yet. Roger had already sent the power of attorney to a handwriting expert, a forensic specialist who'd testified in court cases. The analysis came back in 3 days. Forged. Definitely forged. The report was 12 pages long, detailing pressure points, stroke patterns, tremor analysis. The signature on the power of attorney had been traced from another document, probably from Dad's will, and then carefully copied. But the person who'd copied it had a steady hand. They'd missed the Parkinson's tremor entirely. Roger called the district attorney's office. They opened an investigation. I spent those weeks going through Dad's papers more carefully. I found something else, tucked into an old photo album in his bedroom. A letter, in Dad's shaky handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before he died. My dearest Claire, it began. I know I haven't always been clear these last months. The confusion gets worse every day. But I need you to know, while I still can write this down, the lake house is yours. You have sacrificed everything for me. Your marriage fell apart because you chose to care for me. You put your life on hold. Karen made her choices. She chose her career, her family in the city, her life away from here. You chose me. The house is my thank you. It's my way of making sure you're taken care of. Don't let anyone tell you different. I love you, Dad. I sat on his bed and cried, holding that letter. He'd known, even in his confusion, he'd known I might need proof. The investigation moved quickly once the DA got involved. They found that Karen had visited Dad in March when I'd been at the pharmacy picking up prescriptions. She'd brought documents she'd prepared herself, using a template she'd downloaded online. She'd forged Dad's signature. She'd even forged Roger's signature as a witness, which added notary fraud to the charges. But they found something else too. Karen had already transferred $400,000 from the buyer's deposit into her own account, money that should have stayed in escrow. That made it not just fraud, but theft. The buyers were furious. They sued Karen. The DA filed criminal charges. Karen hired a lawyer who tried to argue that she'd acted in good faith, that she'd believed the power of attorney was valid, that it was all a misunderstanding. But then the prosecution played the recording. Not from me, I really hadn't been recording, but Brad had been so paranoid about me calling that he'd set up an app to record all calls from my number, and the app had automatically uploaded to the cloud. The police had obtained it with a warrant. Karen's voice clear as day. He was dying anyway. This was supposed to even things out. The trial was in January. I sat in the courtroom and watched my sister, dressed in a conservative gray suit, try to explain herself. She cried on the stand. She talked about financial pressure, about feeling neglected by Dad, about thinking she deserved an equal share. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: forgery, fraud, theft, elder abuse. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison. Brad divorced her before she even started serving time. Their house was sold to pay restitution to the buyers. I got the lakehouse, of course. That had never been in question once the forgery was proven. But I also got something else: closure. I'm still living here now, 9 months after the trial. Emma visits on weekends with her kids. We fish off the dock, just like Dad taught us. I've turned Dad's study into a reading room, and I volunteer at the library again, just part-time. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about what happened to Karen, if I regret pressing charges, if I wish I'd just let it go, split the money, kept the peace. I tell them the truth. No, because this wasn't about money or property. This was about Karen looking at 8 years of my life, 8 years of sacrifice and love and exhaustion and grief, and deciding it meant nothing, deciding she could erase it with a forged signature and a convincing story. Dad's letter is framed now, hanging in the living room. I read it sometimes when I'm having a hard day. "You chose me," he wrote. I did choose him. And he chose me too. Karen tried to steal that, but she couldn't, because love and sacrifice aren't things you can forge. They're real. They're witnessed by the people who matter. Tom knew. Mrs. Henderson knew. Roger knew. The truth doesn't need a power of attorney. Last week, I got a letter from Karen. She's allowed to write from prison. It was 3 pages long, mostly justifications and complaints. But at the very end, she wrote, "I never understood why he loved you more." I haven't written back, because she still doesn't understand. It wasn't about Dad loving me more. It was about me being there, day after day, year after year. That's what love is. Not a feeling, an action, a choice. I'm 63 years old. I spent 8 years caring for my father. I lost my marriage, my job, my savings. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Because when I sit on this porch and watch the sunset over the lake, I'm not just seeing water and sky. I'm seeing every conversation Dad and I had here, every quiet morning with coffee, every time he forgot my name and then remembered. Every moment of those 8 years. Karen can't forge that. Prison can't take it away. Nothing can. The house is mine, yes. But more than that, those years are mine. That love is mine. That choice is mine. And I'd choose it all over again.